In Australia, where Rupert Murdoch is from, two former Prime Ministers, one Kevin Rudd from the Labour Party on the left, and the other Malcolm Turnbull, Conservative on the right, led calls for a government inquiry into Australia's news media and the Murdochs' dominant role in it. So earlier, I got the chance to speak to former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd about Rupert Murdoch, someone he's called a cancer on democracy. Thanks so much for coming on the show. You're a former Prime Minister speaking out against the Murdochs. You said in an interview with The Guardian earlier this year, everyone's frightened of Murdoch. They really are. There's a culture of fear across the country, referring to Australia. Why is there this fear? What's the situation like in Australia compared to, say, the US when we're talking about the Murdoch media empire?
Let me just go to the heart of it. In my country, Australia, where you've got Murdoch with 70% ownership of the print media, and on top of that, an ability to reinforce their print media messages through what they are doing in social media platforms and through YouTube and through their Australian equivalent of Fox, which is called Sky in Australia. The stranglehold which Murdoch has on the media messaging in this country is huge. The second point is this. In the last 21 federal and state elections over the last decade in Australia, in each and every one of them, Murdoch has acted as a relentless campaigning beast for the conservative side of politics and increasingly drifting the agenda from the right to the far right. So these two things together, monopoly plus an overwhelming ideological bias to the far right, frankly, is a big challenge and a threat to the vibrancy of our own democracy.
I wonder, you call the Murdoch mafia a cancer on democracy. I wonder, you mentioned both points there. It's the reach, the near monopoly, as you put it, and the extremism, the content, the far-right content they put out. What's more dangerous? What exercises you more?
Well, both, because one turbocharges the other. But let's just go in terms of the far-right content. We see direct impacts of the abuse of the Murdoch media monopoly in Australia, for example, in the politics of climate change. Murdoch, for now more than a decade, has relentlessly campaigned against any government or political party trying to take sustained policy action against the impact of climate change. That has a huge impact on our ability to bring in carbon pricing, a huge impact in even sustaining our mandatory energy target, which I legislated. So it's this practical stuff, like legislation on the ground, acting on climate challenges, where you see and feel the impact of this in a real way.
You mentioned climate change, where, as you say, a lot of the misinformation was put out. The kind of current equivalent of climate change is the COVID crisis and the pandemic and the misinformation that the far right, including Fox News here in the US, has put out, especially the threat of COVID, which was downplayed, and now fueling this anti-vaccine movement through people like Tucker Carlson, the highest rated host on Fox News. And they do this without revealing whether Tucker Carlson has taken the vaccine himself, and in spite of the fact that Rupert Murdoch himself got vaccinated back in December, one of the first people in the UK to turn up and get his vaccine and put out a statement saying he strongly encourages people to get it. And then the next day, Tucker Carlson comes on TV and starts pushing skepticism. It's classic Murdoch, isn't it? Having his cake and eating it.
Well, Murdoch has reduced this to a fine art form after decades of media politics in Australia, the United Kingdom and in the United States, where he has major impact on the public policy debate. You mentioned just then Tucker Carlson and what Fox does on the pandemic in general, first downplaying its significance on behalf of the Trump administration, and now more recently, as you said, this spate of skepticism about the vaccine. This is gross irresponsibility from any public policy perspective on health, the health of working people across America and, frankly, across the world. This is where it gets insidious. It's not a political game. It really affects people's lives. And I believe they stand to be condemned for this gross abuse of their media power.
You mentioned his power and his company's power in Australia, in the UK, in the US. Do you believe there's a correlation globally between the kind of rise of the quote-unquote populist far right and the power of the Murdoch media in certain countries?
Certainly you can track this in the United States, and I think you can also, to some extent, track it in the United Kingdom. For example, I doubt very much whether the whole Trumpian phenomenon, and let's call it the evolution of the Republican Party into a far-right political movement, then its further evolution into the Tea Party, and then the Trump Party, and then what comes after the Trump Party. I doubt this could ever have occurred without the rolling echo chamber of Fox News in the United States over such a long period of time, polarising the body politic in America, feeding raw red meat to the far right, and as a consequence, underpinning the shift in national politics from the centre to the right and the far right. In the United Kingdom, you see the birth of the entire Brexit movement. In my judgment, one of the most irresponsible actions by any government of the United Kingdom to break up the European Union and to diminish British power by taking Britain itself out of Europe. This was hugely backed by the Murdoch beast in the United Kingdom, and again, fueling the operation of what were then fringe operations such as UKIP. I think Murdoch on this question has much to answer for in these two big English-speaking democracies.
I mean, we have an insurrection in this country, January the 6th, which was definitely influenced by Fox News promoting the big lie. There's no doubt about that. In fact, you have defendants in court now claiming Foxitis, that they got brainwashed by Fox. That's the legal defense that they're trying to offer. Let me ask you this, Kevin Rudd. Going back a few years, you were Prime Minister of Australia in the mid-2000s. The Australian, one of Murdoch's leading papers, was very supportive of your political rise to the premiership. You had a very close relationship with the paper's editor-in-chief, a close ally of Murdoch, Chris Mitchell. And just before becoming Prime Minister, you visited Murdoch himself in his New York office. Looking back, do you regret trying to get so close to Murdoch yourself, trying to court him then, given you now rightly call him a cancer on democracy?
Not at all. Prior to 2010, what we saw in Australia was Murdoch being probably a pro-conservative political outfit 2/3 of the time, and 1/3 of the time, historically, being supportive of my own political party, the Australian Labor Party. So if in those days you're the leader of the opposition seeking election, then it made every bit of sense to speak to publishers across the board to maximise the coverage which you are going to get as the alternative government of Australia. I make no apology for that whatsoever, because we're always rowing against the tide in terms of the future of progressive politics in Australia. What has radically changed in the period since 2010 in this country is Murdoch's drift from, let's call it, the centre-right to the far-right. And furthermore, as I said, in the last 21 elections since 2010, campaigning vociferously on behalf of the conservative side of politics. Why? It now suits his far-right ideological interests, and it also suits his direct business interests in terms of a low-tax, low-regulation business environment.
You mention the shift to the far right. There's a lot of talk about the future of the Murdoch empire. His son, Lachlan Murdoch, who was recently in Australia, shuttling back and forth between the US and Australia, he's taken a much more hands-on role, especially on Fox News, when Tucker Carlson was recently criticised for spreading great replacement theory, for spreading white supremacist talking points. It was Lachlan Murdoch who came out very strongly and defended him, doubled down in the corporation's defence of their highest-rated cable host on their network. So I wonder, as someone who's been watching the Murdochs, knows Rupert Murdoch, been around the scene for a while, are you more worried about the next Murdoch than the current Murdoch, given this drift to the far right, as you mentioned?
Anyone who believes that the Murdoch problem disappears when Murdoch Sr. goes to meet his maker has frankly got rocks in their head. Anyone who knows Lachlan Murdoch will know that he is, in fact, even more deeply conservative than his father. Therefore, we are looking at this being an intergenerational transition and the further entrenchment of a far-right media empire, not just in Australia, but around the world. That's because there is this parallel addiction, both on Murdoch Sr.'s part and on Lachlan Murdoch's part, to the far-right political cause and politics in general. And if you want any independent voice which says this has all gone too far in the Murdoch empire, listen simply to what James Murdoch has put on the public record. James Murdoch, son of Rupert Murdoch, resigned recently from the News Corporation Global Board. Why? In his own words, because he was sick and tired of the disinformation deliberately put out to the global public opinion and to global audiences through the Fox network. And so therefore, I think James Murdoch is sounding the alarms as far as what will happen also when Lachlan takes to the helm.
We'll have to leave it there. Former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, thank you so much for your time tonight. Appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
My thanks to Australia's former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd.